All right. Try to center myself in this. I'll look out here so I don't know that's in my face. Welcome, guys. We're going to cover the residential listing agreement, also referred to as the RLA today. So everybody has a packet, and if you've been in any of my contract classes previously, you will be familiar with the documents that precede the residential listing agreement that automatically auto-populate as part of a listing or purchase agreement in CAR forms, which would be the AD, the agency disclosure. Someone probably has two because I don't have one stapled to mine. It's okay. So the agency disclosure is something that needs to accompany all contracts, no matter how many times you write for the same client. It would cover you in any situation with them trying to go around you, go direct to the seller or the listing agent. It also outlines sort of what your fiduciary, ethical, and basic duties like obedience are. Additionally, you'd have the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. This is to cover yourself and your brokerage in the case that the other agent or another co-listing agent is somehow hangs their license at the same brokerage. That doesn't mean the same office, it means the same brokerage. Keller Williams offices are independently owned and operated. However, we have what are called OPs, operating principals, which means they have controlling interest in our company. So anyone who has financial interest in our company, they can have financial interest in multiple offices. So there can be a case made for the fact that though we are independently owned and operated, there is dual agency with any KW office. So keep in mind that if you have to fill out any information about dual agency and it is another KW office, I want you always to treat it as if it is dual agency, okay? All right. Next form here is wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. So this document is just a disclosure stating that wire fraud is very common now. The most common type of wire fraud that's taking place in real estate transactions is that whoever is committing this fraud is somehow getting the information that there is a contract and an open escrow, and they are somehow obtaining contact information for the agents or the buyer directly and sending them wire instructions posing as escrow, asking for their initial earnest money deposit, and these funds are sometimes being wired to these bank accounts, God knows where, to these people who are committing fraud. And once you wire funds, it's nearly impossible to get back. So that's going to kill the deal and obviously make everyone very upset. Not such a big deal on the listing agreement. It is part of the package, but your seller generally isn't going to be wiring funds anywhere. I'm not sure why it's part of it, but it is. So it does still need to be signed. You'll have another one of these.
I didn't notice. I'm sorry.
It's okay. You'll have another one of these. Come here.
My bad.
Come here. You'll have another one of these wire fraud advisories that is auto-populated at the time a purchase agreement is being drafted. Okay, so now we're going to get into the residential listing agreement, page 1. At the top left-hand corner, date prepared. The date prepared is the date you actually write this document. This is not the date of acceptance. This does not have to match the date that your clients sign. Not acceptance, I'm so sorry. This is the listing contract. This does not have to be the date that the listing agreement commences. This does not have to be the date your client signed. This is literally the date that you drafted this document, which is a legal reference date. So you might have a client ask why a certain date is there because it's not the date they're signing, and now you guys know the answer. It's just a reference date. The reason we have a reference date is because you may amend, extend, change, cancel, reduce price of your listing. Anytime you're going to change the terms, that document that you use to change the terms is going to reference this document. So it will say this is an amendment or an extension of a term to the residential listing agreement dated, and that's where this date at the top left-hand corner would be referenced. You would use that date. All right, so moving on to number 1, exclusive right to sell. This is where you would list the seller's name. So when you meet with your clients and you're ready to list their property, do you just sit down and ask them what their names are and how you should fill this out?
No, you look at the public records.
Right, no. The answer was no, you look at public records. So public records will give you a good idea of what to ask and where to start looking in reference to their names to find out if they're in a trust, to find out if they're another type of non-natural person entity. You may be meeting with a husband and wife and yet only one is on title. These things are important because if there's one on title, you'll need to find out, was the property acquired prior to their marriage? If so, whatever spouse is not on title will most likely will definitely have to sign a quitclaim deed for the sale to take place because California is a community property state. The title company may even require a quitclaim deed if the property was acquired by a single spouse with a quitclaim deed at the time of acquisition, just to protect them because of our community property laws here in our state.
So if it was acquired before getting married, they also require that?
Yes. So it doesn't matter if it was acquired prior to marriage, because community property between husband and wife is California state law. The title company would want to circumvent any potential lawsuit or risk. Yes?
Yeah, I was gonna say from a legal standpoint, all property acquired before the course of marriage is considered separate, but just like you said, just to cover yourself, you would have to have it signed or get a quitclaim, because if the marriage has been longer than 10 years, there could always be that presumption that they may try to,
Right.
so you don't want any kind of issues.
Well, it doesn't matter what you want either. The title company simply will not record your transaction without an additional quitclaim. So they just won't do it. But in any case, your listing agreement would not have to have the wife's name or the husband's name, whoever was not on title. And you want to make sure that your listing contract has the correct names. If it's a trust, a lot of times property records doesn't have enough space to actually enter the entire name of the trust, or maybe slightly different, shortened, abbreviated. So it's a great time to ask your sellers for a copy of whatever legal documentation you might need, because on top of knowing how to properly write the name of the vesting in this contract, you're going to need to be able to provide a copy of the trust, articles of incorporation, whatever documents stipulate who has what authority to sign on behalf of that entity to provide title at the time you open escrow. Let's see, what else here? It's also, if you're ready to draft a listing contract, it's a great time to actually ask your title rep for legal investing instead of just going to property records, because they're going to have the actual grant deed that property records is referencing. So when I talked about property records having a limited amount of space to write in the vesting, well, the actual deed is going to have the whole thing written out on it. So I like to open my title report early so that I don't run into problems later, but so you can call your title rep and ask for these this information. And then you don't have to ask your clients, but you do want to verify it with them before you start writing your contract. All right, so we're going to move on to the next line, which is beginning date, also referred to as the commencement of your listing. This is important, very important. I like to have my listings active and valid the second they're signed, meaning the date that they're signing, I like to have my listing commenced. However, I don't necessarily have photos, marketing materials, and all of that ready, right? Sometimes that takes 2 weeks. I would say 2 weeks is generally a rule of thumb, like a good amount of time to get everything completed. But our MLS rules state that within 2 days of our listing commencement date starting, that we have to enter the property on the MLS. Well, how do I do that? I don't want to do a snapshot from my phone, right? And we're not allowed to not place a photo on. I think you can go maybe 24 hours without a photo, but probably never a great idea to launch a listing at all without a photo. Unless something sounds great and I have the time to read something, I never actually look at listings that I get that meet my criteria when they don't have a photo. Because I'm out in the field, I'm busy, right? Hi. So there's a workaround for that. And I think we've gone over it before in my previous classes, but the workaround is I start the commencement date the day that they sign the listing contract. And then I also, at the same time, get from the sellers a signed SELM, which is a seller's exclusion from the multiple listings service. SELM. So remember, if you type SELM in card forms, this form is going to pop up. And what this does, what this document says and does, is it allows us to have permission to keeps us from the obligation to enter the listing to the MLS within that 48-hour time period from our commencement date.
So once you're ready to put it on MLS, do you need to do anything else?
Yes, so we're getting to that. So this doesn't solve all of my problems for me. Do we have any more contracts?
So sorry, it allows the agent to not put it on for 48 hours?
Yes. So the SELM is the seller's, instruction that it's to be withheld from the MLS.
And you have to show what dates it's going to be shown, or?
No, and we're getting to that. So what this would allow me to do, first off, is now that I have a signed listing agreement and the SELM, I'm not putting on the MLS, excuse me, but now, since I do have an active listing contract, I can start to offer the property as an off-market, as a pocket, a coming soon, right? It means I can come to, I can shop it to my own clients, which is advantageous to me. I can shop it to developers if it's a development opportunity or a flip opportunity. I can share it with my office, right, at our meetings and coming soon, possibly get your plans in early. But in addition to the SELM, I get one more document. And the reason for that is, once I am ready to put the listing on the MLS and go live, the SELM only protects me from having to put it on there within the 48 hours. The MLS rules state that when I put it on the MLS, I still have to show a certain amount of days on market. The days on market actually start from the commencement date of this listing, right? So now I'm putting a listing on the MLS first day and it's going to show what, 14, 21 days on market? I don't want that, right? There's stigma attached to properties that have been on the market and are not sold or don't have offers. So here's your next document you're going to get done at the time that you take the listing. It's called Modification to Existing Terms. Yeah, so the Modification to Existing Terms is a document that is just for the listing agreement, changing the terms within it. You could use it to change price and several other things. There is no place to actually like check a box for the for modifying the commencement date. So what I do is they have a free form section, right? So I write in there, commencement date of listing is hereby amended to, and then I place the date that I now have a better idea of into that document, because now all of a sudden I can modify my commencement date to start on the day I want to put it on there, so I can show 0 days on market and give my seller the best opportunity for selling. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Say how you would write it again.
Oh, commencement date of listing period is hereby amended to, and you could say start on, and then you list that date. Now, you may also want to extend your end date for your listing period, right? You might want that full 6 months. Depending upon the property, sometimes I know it's a great price and a great property, I just leave it alone. I don't care about the lost 2 weeks. But if it's not a great price, which unfortunately more than half the time your sellers aren't allowing you to place the property on the market at the price that you're recommending, they want more money, I would probably go ahead and extend the expiration date out the 2 weeks as well.
Excuse me. No.
Yes.
SELM is that not to put on the MLS forever or for 48 hours? I'm sorry.
Ever. Until.
Never. So why do you need this form that you are amending the date?
Because you're not actually never putting the property on the market. You're just using it temporarily.
Oh.
So that you have a valid listing agreement, so that you're protected from losing it to another agent, right?
I see.
So that you can start shopping it off market and networking about it.
I see, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is how I do every single one of my listings. Every single one. Yes.
Is it because you want to market it off market, or is it because you want to get your marketing materials put together and flyers and all that kind of stuff so that you don't have to wait for that stuff to get done? Is that
It's because I want to prepare properly.
right? Okay,
So yeah, but at the same time, I want to know this is my listing.
right. Okay.
So, so I want the signed listing. I want to know it's mine. But yeah, I need time to properly prepare and position it. Otherwise, I'm not doing my client a service. And you do it this way and explain this to your clients, and I can guarantee you they're going to think you're a little step above a lot of other agents out there. All right, so we talked about extending the expiration as well. I was going to point out here the days. It's okay. So the next line is going to be for the address. And then it says situated in and the city. So I want to make sure you guys get this address from public records, okay? Because if you put the wrong city on here, if you put the wrong zip code, it's gonna set a pretty bad precedent with your client, right? Probably nothing more embarrassing than sending over a listing agreement on a home you wanna sell and your client's correcting you for the address. So make sure you're obtaining this from property records. If it's ever multifamily, meaning 2 or more units, there can be multiple addresses associated with the property, but usually the property is marketed and referenced by property records under one address. So your clients may give you 123 Main Street, but public records might actually show 125 Main Street. The contract needs to be written under how the property is legally identified by the county assessor's office and public records. So I want you to also be aware of that. Your clients may say, oh, well, our addresses are both this and this because it's 2 units. It should be legally written however property record shows, okay? All right. Next is the APN number. The APN number you'd also obtain from either a previous MLS listing, you'd obtain it from property records, but if you're a great agent, which you all are going to be, right? You're going to order that legal investing is what it's called from your title officer. And on all legal documents referencing a property, in this case, it's going to be some sort of transfer deed where you're getting the vesting. It can be from when the current owners bought it. It can be from when they transferred into their personal trust. It's going to have the APN also itemized on there, okay?
Is that the same thing as prelim?
No, legal investing is just a copy of the last transfer deed. So it has nothing to do with a prelim.
So as soon as we get the listing, we order that through.
Yeah. In fact, as soon as, when I'm going for a listing appointment, I'm probably asking for that information. Yeah. All right, so moving on, there are 2 check boxes here. One is for the option of selecting that it's a manufactured or mobile home. A mobile home is sometimes personal property and sometimes real estate property. And it has to do with whether or not the land is sold with it. A lot of mobile home parks are sort of like HOAs in the sense that no one owns land, just the personal property that's parked atop it and they have a lease. We don't do that. We're real estate agents. We're not licensed or brokered to sell personal property. So you'll want to find that out if you're ever dealing with a mobile home. Let's see, the next option is this property is being sold as part of a probate, conservatorship, or guardianship. See addendum for additional terms. What addendum are they talking about? I forget the name of it, but if you check this box, it will automatically auto-populate. All right? If there are 2 types of probate, like I said, next week I am teaching probate class. There's probate with court confirmation and probate without court confirmation. If you are without court confirmation, you're golden. It's pretty much a standard sale. If you are with court confirmation, there are actual court hearings, procedures with guidelines, advertising guidelines, and some additional documents that you'll need. In any case, if you check here, you're gonna have an addendum that pops up that will actually guide you through some of the things you're going to need and information you're going to need. So when in doubt, read your contracts. They usually have some pretty good instructions for you. Okay, so moving on, we're at section 2, listing price and terms. The listing price shall be, this is where, what's written here, 1,300,000. This gets written out when to the right you type in the actual numerical number that you're going to list for, so you don't have to worry about that. B, listing terms. Sometimes you may have an extenuating circumstance, some additional listing term. Perhaps you have a tiered commission structure, and if you don't know what that is, it can mean many different things. But let's say my client tells me, I will list this property with you, and if you get me full list price within 60 days, I will pay you a 3% commission. But if you don't get me full list or you sell it after 60 days on the market, I'm gonna pay you the standard 2.5. This is not a common thing, by the way, guys. But this space, additional listing terms, this is for your non-standard things that you need to add in. My guess is, however, if you're doing something non-standard, that it's probably not gonna fit in the 2 lines that are allotted here, and you're probably actually going to have to draft a formal addendum to explain it clearly. Okay? Yes?
Is this where you would put that there's price adjustment after 2 weeks?
No, if there was going to be a price adjustment after 2 weeks, and it was part of the listing terms, you probably want to put it on an addendum. And you're also going to need another one of the documents we've already talked about, the modification of existing terms. Yeah.
Probably this is where we put the 4% if you present.
Yeah, I mean, it's short here, if you are committing to a particular type of marketing commitment, maybe, and they're concerned about you living up to it contractually, maybe you type that, put this in here. It's not a commonly used spot, but I wanted you to be aware of its availability in the case that you do something out of the ordinary. All right, moving on to section 3, compensation to broker. 3A, seller agrees to pay broker as compensation for services irrespective of agency relationships, either blank % of the listing price or blank for a finite dollar amount, right? Our industry standard is percentage. If you are going to be doing a commission for a flat rate, you would definitely have to go to our broker, which is Brian Kraft, and you would have to get approval for that. But I have never, ever in my entire career had anyone come to me and say they were paying me a flat rate. What can anyone tell me what our industry standard commission is? 2.5 for one side, but remember when you're doing, a listing agreement, you're gonna enter the total commission that is paid to both agents for buyer and seller. So yes, it's typically 5. If you can get 6, more power to you.
Get 6.
I see that every so often, but it's rare.
I would be careful with going for 6. We have a very, very savvy client in our areas, and
It's so competitive.
yes, it's very competitive. I wouldn't necessarily want to rub the seller the wrong way and lose the listing entirely. The only time I've actually asked for 6 is when I was doing something extraordinary for the seller, handling a really huge marketing campaign, or doing something above and beyond outside of, I'm paying for staging, or I'm overseeing some construction stuff going on, or remodeling, which technically you're not supposed to do, right? Because we're real estate agents. But when I do extenuating things, or I'm fronting money to get the listing prepared for market, I may ask for more. Yes?
Have you noticed it to be common, because I've seen it personally in the valley a little bit more, where I do see 3%, so is that a little bit more common over there? I feel like maybe because there's more inventory or something.
It depends. I mean,
like I've seen it deep in the valley.
I've
where
also
3%.
seen deep valley at 2% though.
Really?
I think the valley deviates a lot.
I just don't ever see 3% around here, hardly.
Hey, my
So
my
rare.
6% listings that I've had have been Brentwood.
Really? It's
Yes.
so rare.
I say generally with my experience, what I'm seeing is houses that are like on the lower end, you have a higher chance of getting a higher percentage.
100%.
Here in Beverly Hills, the median price point is in the $7 million range. So that's why, if anything, I think it's less.
Yeah. So when you get into super high end, then you're looking at even less.
Like
And a lot of times you're co-listing with 1 and 2 agents, but you probably want to, because at this point, your marketing costs, like the videos you're gonna do for these videos, can be in the $10,000, $20,000 range.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking mega houses. It's all relative, so just keep it in mind, but our standard is 5%. And, it's really important, guys. our board says that we should be splitting our commissions equally. Now, there are extenuating circumstances where you're maybe doing something more for your clients and that's why you're taking a higher compensation. But if you have 5, you should not be taking 3 and offering 2 to the buyer's agent. Why? Can anyone tell me why this may be an ethical violation? It's because you are not making the property the most attractive to buyer's agents. Therefore, the property may not be shown as much. You ever heard someone say, I don't show Redfin listings because they offer 1.5 to the buyer's agent? So that's one of the reasons why we are strongly encouraged to split our total commission on a listing 50-50, because your fiduciary duty is to your seller, and to make sure that as many potential buyers as possible are shown the property so that the seller obtains the highest price because they have the most interest. It has the most exposure.
But the seller agent pays for the photography and the staging and things like that. Sometimes they say, I think 3.5, you get 65%.
I don't know about you, but even on my $2-3 million listings, I'm probably spending $1,000 total on everything I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see how $1,000 would be equal to, let's see, on a $2 million listing, it's $120,000 in total commission versus $100,000. So that's $10,000 each way. I don't see how my $1,000 as a listing agent translates to $10,000 more for me on the close in commission. But bottom line, as a listing agent, I'm expected to cover those costs. Absolutely, 100%. If you have a listing, you're more likely to close that deal.
And even if the house doesn't sell, you just eat the cost. You just write it as an expense?
Typically, you eat the cost if the home doesn't sell, right? You're taking a calculated risk when you choose to list a property that the sellers are unwilling to list at current, fair market value, or has something, unusual about it that makes it less desirable. However, there are times when I've spent a lot of money, and I still want to take the listing that I made it very clear to the sellers who are, unwilling to list it at current market value. I will list your property. I want to show you all of the things that I'm going to do to try to market it. These are my actual expenses. And if I have a really higher end property where I'm putting a lot of money out, I may actually write into the contract that if we don't sell under the terms of the contract by expiration, that the seller is to reimburse me for all of my marketing materials. I probably would also at that point agree to release the photos to my seller as they've paid me back for them, allowing them to use them as their own property. I've never had that happen though. I've never had a listing that didn't sell. I've had listings that sat there forever that I extended and I reduced painfully and slowly, but I eventually sold it. So yes, you can write that in, but no, you should not be considering that as part of the commission structure. Now, I've talked about this before, but just to talk about it again, if for some reason you do have a valid reason to take more in the listing side when you split the commission out, then you're offering to the cooperating buyer's agent. In the MLS, there's a disclosure section, and there's an option called Listing Broker Advantage. This disclosure needs to be made on the MLS listing. This is the only place that disclosure is made whatsoever. And you should do this because nobody looks at that section anyways. But because if the buyer's agent were to find out somehow and you don't have that disclosed, the multiple listing service where the buyer's agent can see, there's an actual case for them asking for you to make reprimands for that missing percentage of the commission not being split equally.
What was that one called?
It's not a form.
It's not.
When you enter the actual listing into the MLS, there's a section called disclosures, and it's called the Listing Broker Advantage. Yes.
So for example, for one of my listings, I'm getting a little bit more than the other side, but it's because the seller is 93 years old, has no access to the internet. He's moved assisted living facilities. Now he moved 45 minutes away.
Mm-hmm.
So I really feel I am totally entitled. I always believe in being like ethical and fair, but I think this would be one of those extenuating circumstances.
Yes, it sounds like it to me also. But if you don't have that section checked in the MLS, go and do it.
Wow, okay.
Go and do it because it's not disclosed to the buyer's agent. And though it may be a valid reason, if push came to shove, you don't know if anyone else would see it that way. So as long as you check that box, I think you're pretty good. But I'd go and alter your listing as soon as class was over.
Okay.
Yes.
If you do a listing and you have a friend of yours who wants to buy the place, do you get both commissions, or how does that work?
If you have a listing and you have a friend who wants you to represent them as a buyer, as long as the seller is okay with you providing dual representation, then yes, it's totally fine, and you'd be entitled contractually to the total commission. Typically speaking, when I represent both sides, I try not to reduce my commission in any way, but I am much more likely to reduce my commission when I'm representing both sides and I have so much more coming to me. You know, there's a lot less, sometimes there's a lot less work involved. It depends on your clients and the condition of the property. When it's just you. Yeah, when you're representing both sides, right? You don't have to go to another agent and wait for them to respond. At the same time, it can be 3, 4, 5 times the amount of work. You can't clearly advise your clients if they are having a difficult time coming to resolution on something, or the relationship becomes a bad one between buyer and seller. It can be a lot more work to you, and I don't care who you are. There is no way you're going to give your best service to both sides. I did one recently where, I had to present it to the seller and also to the buyer, is that, hey, I'm a strategic agent. That is my biggest strength. But because I have duties to keep my conversations with both of you private, I'm basically going to be giving both of you the same advice I would as if I didn't know what I was telling the other person. So you're gonna have to make your best decisions, without any advantage, because the other side's gonna have exactly the same information I'm giving you. So that is the reason why a lot of sellers might not want you to do that. Now, there are some workarounds to that. I will on occasion represent both sides, but I'd actually really prefer to refer it out to someone in my office that I enjoy working with. And the reason for that is because, well, not only do I have a good relationship with them, most likely I'm going to have a pretty easy time because I referred them business, right? They're going to want to make it work with me, but I also won't get hit up by the buyer or seller to reduce my commission so much. Let's say there's bad inspections or something and the buyer wants a credit. The seller, if I'm representing both sides, would be much more likely to try to ask me to credit out of my commission, right? Because I'm making so much. But, Nagar, if I referred a buyer to you and had you write for them,
I will kiss your everything.
Thank you. But I mean, the buyer wouldn't be asking me to credit it. The seller wouldn't be asking me to credit it, right? So typically the way that'd be structured is, depending upon where I'm at with that buyer, maybe anywhere from me receiving a 50% referral from the commission to a 25%. And that's something you just personally negotiate with another agent in the office. Yeah.
What if there are 2 agents in the listing and they also get the buyer? Can one work with the buyer and one with the seller?
Yes, and I've actually had that happen where I had a co-listing agent on a listing that I had, and I had multiple buyers that asked me to write for them. In fact, I had 4 buyers on the same property ask me to write for them. So I wrote for the first one. Ethically speaking, I just don't see it. I would never write more than 1 buyer offer on a property I also have listed. Never. Not in a million. So I had my partner write another one, and then I asked 2 different agents from my office to write the 3rd and 4th. Yeah, so.
Who got the deal?
Somebody else. Somebody else got the deal. See, that's how you know I'm an ethical agent. Somebody else got the sale. Somebody else had a question?
Oh, I did.
Yes.
Can you ask, because we did this before, we asked title not to show the amount that we were getting on the listing side to the buyer's agent once everything was all said and done.
Are you from somewhere else?
I came, just Encino was the last place, but we did a 3% on the listing side and we gave 2.5% on the buyer's side. It was a lot of work.
I asked because you said title. Does your escrow division work out of a title company? Okay, escrow. Yeah, you can absolutely. In fact, escrow, a seasoned escrow officer is automatically going to split your commission off from the buyer's agent's commission if it's different, whether it's higher or lower.
Okay.
They don't necessarily, they know it can cause problems. So a seasoned escrow officer is most likely going to do it without even asking you if you want it done. But they don't always.
So you gotta make sure you ask them.
Yeah, you can ask them to split it out. However, I'm a super seasoned agent. I know when I see a split commission instruction, you're probably making more money than me, and I don't like that. Do I let it affect my performance in the deal? I don't. But I mean,
But by then you're already closing, right? Because they're already getting the.
commission instructions come out at the beginning of the transaction.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, as soon as escrow instructions are provided, which I think the way our contract is written should be 5 days, within 5 days. Not every escrow is so great. The escrow company and officer I use usually get it out within 24 to 48 hours. Always a good bet when you use in-house, you can stand there if you really need to get something. But yeah, I mean, you can definitely do it. I'd ask escrow to take care of it. Let's see, what else? All right, the next section is A2. A2 says that if within blank calendar days after the end of a listing period or any extension or after any cancellation of this agreement, unless otherwise agreed, seller enters into a contract to sell, convey, lease, or otherwise transfer the property to anyone or that person's related entity who physically entered and was shown the property during the listing period. And I'm not going to read the rest of it. The general gist of it is this blank is where you'd fill out a numeric time period, and our industry standard is 180 days. If it's a higher end property that takes longer to sell, that I put a lot of money into, sometimes I will actually go for 365.
Wow.
I have had sellers ask me to shorten this from 180 days down. I would do it because I want the listing. So I wouldn't recommend arguing, but you know, a listing it's optional for you to take a listing at the terms that the seller wants to, right? Just like it's optional for the seller if they want the terms that you're asking for. So 180 days is standardly what I'd fill in here. The key part of this entire clause, well, there are a couple of key parts, but the first key part, if you look, it's two lines down after the little I that's in the brackets. It says who physically entered and was shown. I want you to circle that. Physically entered and was shown. So this means that your exclusions list, and I'll go into that in further detail in a second, only applies to potential buyers who physically entered and saw the property. I worked for someone a long time ago who actually crossed this line off. And I sort of like the idea. And depending on whether or not I think it will fly with the seller, I actually cross this off. And why do I do that? Well, sometimes
They buy it sight unseen.
yeah, sometimes they buy sight unseen or from a video, or their husband went in, or their mother went in, or their neighbor or their sister went in and they purchased. Or their assistant went in. You know, it's a flip property, their assistant or someone who they work with went in, right? And it wasn't the actual buyer who physically entered the property. Well, I would say if someone who was my employee walked into a property, advised me, and I made the purchase on the property, that's my representative. It's almost like I'm there. And as a listing agent, I would really feel like I was entitled to that commission. I showed it to the person who ended up buying it. So I wanted you to be aware of that sentence there, and the fact that you can optionally cross things out. But I would be very careful as to who you chose to do that with. You really don't want to start a distrustful relationship with your sellers at the time you're taking a listing, okay? The other part of this whole clause is that if your listing is getting ready to expire, in order for this clause and that 180-day period or whatever time frame you write in this to apply and protect you so that you can still collect commission, you have to provide what's called an exclusions list, a list of all of the people who've seen the property during the time you had it listed. And you have to deliver this entire list prior to the cancellation or expiration of this contract. So if it's going to expire tomorrow, I'd better have that exclusions list out today. If my client talks about wanting to cancel the listing agreement for any reason, well, before I send those cancellation instructions out, I'm going to send over the exclusions list. This can be a daunting task because when you have open houses, people are coming in and they
They
may
don't
not sign in.
Yeah.
This, you may have other agents hold your open houses and they may not have people sign in. So I strongly encourage you to find a gentle way that will work for you to try to get your open house attendants to sign in. I generally say, hi, welcome, my name's Kristen. Let me know if you have any questions. Would you mind signing in for me? The seller would like me to keep track of who's entering the property, right? Sounds reasonable, maybe a safety concern, yes?
I was gonna say too, with signing in, I know sometimes people don't wanna sign in, but in regards to like liability, this person is in the home and they're in the property,
Right.
so isn't it like?
Right, and that's why I say,
liability too?
I say that, I really need a sign in. You don't have to give me your contact info if you don't want to. I'm not looking to contact anyone who's not interested, so you don't need to worry about that. This is for me to keep track of who's coming and going.
Make their own name sometimes.
Also, a lot of times also the agent may come as a representative and they say, okay, I'm an agent, they may or may not sign, and we never know who their client is. They may go afterwards to discuss.
Right, but an agent, this wouldn't apply. Their client didn't physically enter. So an agent may present a property to a client or preview it for them,
Oh, I see.
because then
I see.
everyone on earth would pretty much be
Slippery stuff.
subject to this,
Right, got you.
this exclusions list. John?
No, just saying that sometimes the agent, they sign the wrong name and wrong telephone number, you have no way to get in them, even though if they sign it.
Yes.
If they have a.
That's why I recommended letting people know. I'm simply having sign-ins to keep track of who's coming, entering the property. But if you are not comfortable leaving your contact information, that's totally fine. I'm not gonna contact anyone who doesn't want me to. I make sure that these people know that I just need it for my record-keeping purposes, and that I'm not going to pressure them. Because for what reason would a seller write down a fake name? Someone attending an open house, a potential buyer, why would they leave fake information or not want to leave information? Because there are a lot of agents out there who will incessantly call them, incessantly email them, or they're already working with someone, right? So I make sure it's clear that I'm just looking for their name if they're not comfortable leaving their contact info. And you don't need to provide the contact info on the exclusions list, so don't worry about that.
Who do you give the exclusive list to, the owner?
The property owner, yeah. And if your listing contract is expiring or canceling and you're delivering an exclusions list, I would strongly recommend CCing a manager or the transaction coordinator, someone else in the office, so you can actually prove that delivery of this list was made. I would probably just ask the property owner to confirm receipt of the list. Which is another reason why I'd make sure I sent it over before the cancellation or the expiration. All right, so moving on. The other thing I wanted to mention was back into record keeping for the exclusions list. I highly recommend entering every single showing that you have on the property in your calendar in a certain format. Doesn't matter what the format is. So like naming your showing appointments in your calendar, your digital calendar somehow. So for me, I say showing, property address. And then in the body, like in the info, I'd put contact information and names, the names of the actual buyers. I always ask agents for their client's name. And that way, if I do have to provide an exclusions list, I can go into my calendar and I can literally search showing and the property address, and every single showing I've ever had is going to pop up, and all I have to do is list the names that are in those calendar appointments. Okay. Trying to write it down or keep track of it any other way, I don't see how you're gonna easily get it all in one place if you ever need it. All right.
Then after an open house, I guess you would go and do the same thing. You would just put it somewhere where you can.
Maybe this might come back to bite me. But I actually just keep a copy of all of my open house sign-in sheets in one folder. And if I need to compile an exclusions list, I'm gonna have to type it out individually anyways. I'd like to put the energy out there in the world. I'm gonna sell this thing. So I haven't. No, I haven't. But this is also another another thing you should consider, right? So I don't quite think that it is fair if you have another agency or open houses to ask for their sign-in sheet, because those are their buyer leads, right? So what I do is I ask for them just to either, because usually it's a name and then contact info on the right-hand side, just cut it off and send me a picture of, or email me or make me a copy of the names for my exclusions list. That's the only reason why I'm not looking to contact anyone that could potentially be your lead. Or to black it out, whatever it is, to make them feel comfortable.
And so do people really go after, like, say you had a listing and it expired and somebody else picked it up and it sold a month later, whatever.
Mhm.
Do people go and look to see who bought that house and if the name is on your list and
Yeah, especially in the high end.
yeah.
I mean, I used to sit on the ethics committee at our board office, and I have had one instance where something came before us for commission because the listing agent provided an exclusions list to the seller in time and had someone listed on it that bought it after it was listed with a new listing agent. And the original listing agent had shown this buyer the property 3 times. They just didn't think it was worth the price, and I think after a 3 or 4 month period where they looked and couldn't find anything they liked better, they actually came back and bought it at that price. And the original listing agent had was entitled to the commission and stepped in as the listing agent performing the transaction at that point.
What is the statute of limitations? from
Whatever
the
time period you
expiration?
write in here.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah,
So the current listing agent would get nothing.
that's right. So when you take an expired listing, you have to get confirmation of either the cancellation or expiration of the deal, and you should be asking your client for an exclusions list also, because it's on you. You're the one who's going to be out money for your marketing and your time and your effort, right? So if you're taking an expired listing, and I hear people talk about going after expireds all the time, but I never hear them talking about this, you had better get the confirmation and the exclusions list from your client. Now, if your client says, I didn't receive an exclusions list, golden, great, because you are just now capitalizing possibly on buyers that are cultivated by the previous listing agent who was not smart enough or diligent enough to actually do their job and deliver that list. So it doesn't matter if, whoever buys it was in there 20 times when previously listed. If that exclusions list wasn't delivered to the client prior to cancellation or expiration, you don't owe them anything. That's your commission.
So question, on that last scenario, how did you find out that the new agent was?
How did they find out? Because they got a copy of the exclusions list and they asked their broker, and their broker did the right thing, called the other brokerage. And I think they were trying to negotiate where the listing agent split the commission, but the previous listing agent had spent so much money and done so many showings. I think it was we were looking at it, it was 200 or something, right? So, that brokerage decided there's no way we're gonna split this with you. There's just no way. I saw another hand.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, what if a buyer comes in
Mm-hmm.
and they don't tell you that they are working with another agent as a buying agent, and
A
they
buyer?
sign your list, and then you give that exclusions list, and that person's in that list, and they end up coming back with their agent? How does that work?
Well, with the buyer, I mean,
It's complicated. I was just thinking.
it's not necessarily
But
complicated. If a
people
buyer
sometimes
says they're
don't
not
tell
working
you.
with an agent and writes with you, you're golden.
Mhm.
Unless that agent has already shown them that property or already written on that property. I've actually had a buyer who had me write on a property they had already written on with another agent without telling me. Yeah,
Because sometimes that can
Yeah.
happen with buyers.
that does happen.
Mhm.
Now, I found out about it, and because the listing agent recognized the client name on the offer, they told me, I went to my broker. My broker said, well, it could get into a gray area where you might have to be, giving some of that commission away to another buyer's agent. She's like, but it depends on the reason. So if you can get your buyers to write in an email something stating that they decided to work with you and write a new offer with the new agent being you because they were displeased with the previous agent's service, then the buyer has the right to decide who they want to work with.
Sure.
And so it's very arguable at that point that all of the commission should be yours, right? So Just if you find something like that out, wanna do your best to mitigate your losses. And also, if it becomes an active dispute between you and another agent, unless I have something like that for my client, it's probably in my best interest and my client's best interest to go ahead and just cut them in somehow. Negotiate something as small as I can, if I'm comfortable with it. It's always better just to get it done and closed.
Fair.
Yeah, be fair. Could come back to bite you in a big way. All right, moving on to section C. In addition, seller agrees to pay broker blank. Well, this might be where you could talk about reimbursement for marketing costs if that's something you pre-negotiated. But remember, this is not standard. Standard is you're the one taking the risk and putting all the costs up for marketing materials, photography, anything like that, any advertising, okay? Let me give you an example. So I had a listing one time when I was working for other agents where it was this great big Hancock Park listing, photography, video, aerial shots. It was really expensive for the marketing. I mean, not on the scale of what those agents were doing, but it was, I don't know, maybe $9,000 in costs of prepping, of getting marketing materials, photos, prepping for market, securing advertisement. And the seller had told the agents I was working for up front, my neighbor has expressed interest in purchasing the property, but we can no longer wait for them to make up their mind. We need to sell because we took a job in another state. So what we said was, great, thanks for letting us know. There is a place to actually exclude the neighbors from here. So what they said is, if we're gonna sell to the neighbors, we've been neighbors for 35 years, we're gonna sell direct without the services of an agent. And those listing agents said, fine, that's no problem. We're totally fine to do that. But what we'd like is for you to agree contractually to reimburse us for all the costs we've had on the property if that's what ends up happening. Guess what? It ended up happening. And they cut us a check for all of the costs. But, they probably saved, what, $400,000 in commission? So it was worth it to pay $9,000 for them. All right, moving on, section D. Seller has been advised broker's policy regarding cooperation with and the amount of compensation offered to other brokers. D1, broker is authorized to cooperate with and compensate brokers regarding through the multiple listing service, MLS, by offering to MLS brokers out of broker's compensation specified in 3A, which is the total commission for both sides listed above, either blank % of the purchase price or blank dollars.
This is where you put the check.
This is where you put the buyer's portion of the total commission in here. Buyer's agent's portion of the total commission in here. So if up at the top you have 5% here and you're offering 50% to the buyer's agent, which is also referred to as a cooperating agent, down here you're gonna write in 2.5. Any idea why this percentage, this portion, this whole section of the listing contract is in here? It wasn't in here, I can't remember how long ago. It's been in here for a very long time, but it wasn't always in here. It was because agents were taking like 5-6% and offering 1.5-2% to the buyer's agent without disclosing that to the seller, which is clearly not in the seller's best interest, right? So make sure you have this filled out. I oftentimes, because there is not a whole lot that you need to write in the bottom portion of this first page, I have oftentimes seen as a common error when I'm reviewing other people's listing contracts that they forgot to enter this. Make sure you enter this. This needs to match whatever you enter into the MLS. If there is a deviation and there's not an amendment to the terms of the listing contract, you're gonna be bound to pay what's on the MLS or what was originally here, the higher amount, to the cooperating broker, okay? Let's see here. So section D2. So this, there are some divisions. So like our board is Beverly Hills Greater Los Angeles Association of Realtors, and everyone who belongs to that board has access to our MLS. We have what's called cooperating membership, I think. What that means is there are multiple MLSs. So like in South Bay, they have their own MLS. That's like Redondo, Manhattan, Hermosa, Torrance, Palos Verdes, Rolling Hills. In Ventura, I think they have their own. And they all have different names. Ours is called Claw, our MLS area. Tell me, what is it? You remember the name? Combined. Los Angeles, West Side. Combined Los Angeles and West Side. That's what CLAW stands for. So, there are some MLSs that do not have a cooperating agreement with our MLS. For instance, I had a client who wanted to buy in a city called Lone Pine. Anyone know where that is? Oh, wow. I didn't know where it was. It's like 3/4 of the way to Mammoth from here. And that's the best way I can describe it. It's not around anything else. Bishop and Mammoth, I guess.
It's where you stay before you climb Mount Whitney.
Yes, it's where you stay before you climb Mount Whitney. Yeah. Well, I went on our MLS and I couldn't find anything in that area or the surrounding areas. The reason was because the board and their MLS did not have an agreement to cooperate with our MLS. Why would that's actually pretty common. Why would that be common? It's common because they have to change the back end infrastructure of their program design. I don't even know what you call that. So that they can interact with one another. Like a square peg can't fit in a round hole. So their MLS may be set up entirely different to where the information doesn't transfer over. And so that's why it would be a non-cooperating participant. So when that happens, there is a special document that you may need to have signed to make sure that their board authorizes payment for a non-participating member to pay you commission. So you're representing a buyer, right? Non-participant area. You can get this form from Car Forms, and if you probably if you search non-participant, you'll find it. Our listing contract circumvents that entirely. So when an agent that's outside of our cooperation in MLS comes and their buyer makes an offer and they win and they enter escrow with you, you don't need that because this next section here says that under section 3E, broker is authorized, 3D2, broker is authorized to cooperate with and compensate brokers operating outside the MLS as per broker's policy. So we don't need that. Our area covers it for all other agents, but not all. If you use a different type of listing contract, it may not have this in here. So if it's a probate, I don't think I saw that in the probate listing. And you're not going to see the listing paperwork anyways, right? Because you're the buyer's agent, if that's the case. So just protect yourself and make sure that you get the extra form or send it over to the listing agent if you're writing on something out of area, okay? Section 3E. Thank God I've never had this happen, and I hope you never have it happen either, but I guess there could be a situation in which you have a listing and you sell it and it's in escrow, and for whatever reason the seller either decides they just don't want to pay you, or they want to reduce your commission, or they're angry at you and don't think you should receive it, or they're just cheap and dishonest, right? So this section of the listing agreement protects you and says escrow can pay you without further instruction from the seller, as long as you've performed your duties and sold the property, right? Technically, the seller should be signing commission instructions, but if push came to shove, and you may or may not have to go to court over it, depending on how the escrow company feels about it and how conservative they're being, your listing contract actually says that the seller has to. And the seller signs this. So you go to court, my guess is, as long as you didn't do something super detrimental or completely neglect your duties, you're going to be fine in receiving it. Let's see. I have had a seller, when they didn't get the price they wanted for their property, tell me that I was going to reduce my commission and make the buyer's agent reduce their commission.
Wow.
And I said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. You send a contract. I've worked my ass off. First off, I'm not doing it. And secondly, it's public record what we're offering to the buyer's agent. And at the time that they rate the offer, it needs to be publicly posted in the MLS. It's not a possibility. I can't legally do that. I can't even ask, and I'm not going to. And I'm unwilling to do it. So I have had that happen.
What they say after that? Were they just like...
He was huffing and puffing. This is a repeat client. He used to be a Fox executive, and he's used to arguing and seeing what he can get away with by yelling.
Wow.
When I did that, he actually said, he's like, I wasn't sure if you had it in you. He's like, I'm glad you're my agent. But I was kind of mad about it for a little while. I was pretty mad. But at least told me something about him. There were some difficult times with him in the deal based on inspections after that. And he was pretty difficult and raised his voice a couple other times. And I knew that if I stood firm and gave him some time to calm down, he would come around. But I didn't let it bother me so much after that first time. But you will have sellers who try to pull that on you, unfortunately.
Nice people.
I've never had a seller go to escrow and say, you're not paying my agent, but
Wow, that would
that's
be
what
a
our
lot of
contract is
nerves.
covering here. Okay, that would be bad. Okay, so under section F, so if you are taking an expired listing or a canceled listing, it says, F1 says, seller represents that seller has not previously entered into a listing agreement with another broker regarding the property unless specified as follows. I would actually write on here that it was previously listed with, and I would put the broker and the agent, and was canceled or expired, and I would have the date written on here. So the importance of this section is that, well, first off, you're protecting yourself as the agent taking that type of listing. And the reason being is you have it documented, so if the exclusions list wasn't provided, you know, you show that you did your due diligence at that time. The second thing is if you have a seller who is listing with multiple people, I've never heard of anyone that crazy, but I'm sure there are people out there crazy enough. You know, then the seller is the one committing fraud, and let's say you sell a property, another agent comes in and says, I have a valid listing on it too. Well, you know, the way our contract's written, the seller is probably going to be on the hook for it so that you're not as an agent.
So can I just ask you again, what is the thing that you would write in there? I didn't get it all down.
Oh, that the property was previously listed with, and I'd list the brokerage name and the agent name, and that it was either canceled, if it was canceled, or if it was expired on, and whatever date it was. And you should, like I mentioned before, actually get a copy of the cancellation or previous listing contract from your client so that you can verify that, right? Because if you see an expiration date that's 3 months out, you're gonna be like, was it canceled? I need to see the cancellation then. Was it modified somehow? I need to see the modification that shows the expiration. I have had a seller try to hire me to list their property prior to the expiration of their existing listing contract. They were uncomfortable and didn't want to go through canceling early with the listing agent that they had at the time. You cannot do that. You can't even talk to a client that has their property currently listed with another agent unless they reach out to you. If they reach out to you, you can talk to them, but you cannot advise them on their current listing. All you can do is talk about what you would do with the listing once it was yours, if they chose to work with you. Yeah, but that's it. You cannot give advice on the actual listing as it stands while it's listed with another agent. Just like if you talk to a buyer who's in escrow with another agent on a property, you should not be giving them advice as to their existing purchase. Why? You could be giving them bad advice because they probably aren't going to give you all of the information. They probably don't know all of the little intricacies and extenuating circumstances. So they may be unhappy about something, but they don't even know enough to present the information right to you. You give them advice that's completely wrong.
You're not getting any benefits,
right,
and potentially putting yourself on the hook.
You're taking on liability without any commission.
Exactly.
All right. So F3, if the property is sold to anyone listed above during the time, seller is obligated to compensate another broker. Look, broker is not entitled to compensation under this agreement. Broker is not obligated to represent in such transaction. This is talking about that exclusions list. So what it's saying is that if the second listing agent is attached to the property, but someone on the exclusions list from the previous listing agent makes an offer that's accepted, the current listing agent gets no money, and it says that they are not obligated to represent seller. What does that mean? It means that you'd either A, step away, you could actually decide that you still want to represent the seller. Why would you do this with no commission? Well, the seller may not want their previous listing agent representing them, so they may actually decide that they're going to go ahead and pay you some additional compensation in an outside agreement so that you'll represent them. Or let's say maybe you represent the buyer in this instance also, and it'll be easier, or I don't know, you may want to continue on dual representation. Not saying it would always be easier. There could be a lot of reasons you might stay on, but you are not entitled to commission. So I would look at that one very carefully. One of the most common questions I've seen when this kind of dispute, when something like this happens, is, well, who represents the seller now? And it's that previous listing agent, unless, you know, you want to work for no money, or they decide they're going to pay more money to you. But the seller is not obligated to work with the past listing agent. So they have to pay them, but they're not obligated to use them. Most of the time they do use them though, because they're paying them. All right, so the next page, page 2, items included, excuse me, I don't know why I can't speak today. Items excluded and included. Unless otherwise specified in a real estate purchase agreement, all fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property are included, and personal property items are excluded from the purchase price. So guys, from a legal standpoint, anything that's permanently attached to a property is included in the sale. It's called a fixture. This would mean light fixtures. This would mean curtain rods. This would mean blinds. This would mean, excuse me?
Chandelier?
Yeah, I said light fixtures.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. This would mean, so we've talked about this before, but TV mounts, but not the TV. So the mount that's on the wall is attached. Audio visual equipment, security equipment that's attached would automatically be included. So you need to keep these things in mind and bring them up with your seller at the time you're taking a listing, so that it doesn't become an issue in escrow and it doesn't bum your seller out, or it doesn't become a sticking point that people fight about that causes you to lose the deal, right? Because a buyer could get upset and walk away from something if they're not getting what they want during the course of escrow. But I seriously doubt that any buyer is going to not make an offer because a certain light fixture is excluded at the time that they enter the property. So if you have it excluded from the beginning, you're good to go. Where else would you need to exclude it? So you would do this in the listing contract because you have an obligation to your seller to present the property this way. But you would also need to, probably I'd include it on the MLS under private agent remarks. But B, I don't care how many places it is. If it is not in your purchase agreement, a counter offer, or an addendum to one of those two things prior to acceptance of an offer, it does not matter. So even though it's in the listing agreement, even though it's on the MLS, even though I told the buyer's agent verbally, I'm on the hook as a listing agent because I didn't make sure it was also in the purchase contract. All right? So basically the listing contract is between me and my seller, and it's also for me to be aware and have this conversation of what needs to be included and excluded. Anyone know my famous example of of a time that my buyers insisted on including something? No? Come on. So I had a listing that was a townhouse, and they had a private rooftop deck, and they had this big, beautiful patio furniture up there. And my seller said, this has to go with the house. And I was like, what? Okay, but why? They said, because there was no way to get it up there except to crane it in, because it's so large and it's a narrow stairway up to the private rooftop deck. It cost us $10,000 to get it up there. And we are not paying $10,000 to get it down. So I had to make sure it was in my listing contract on the MLS and that it was in my purchase agreement. But thankfully the people who bought the property really liked it and left it there. It was nice.
Did I charge extra for the furniture, or was it just?
No. So it's not very typical to include personal items in a purchase contract, although it does happen on occasion. And if it happens, I would go ahead and write it for your buyer. But if it's more than 1 or 2 items, it may become tricky if there's a loan. The reason why is because the lender is making the loan on the residential property. Do you guys want to go move cars?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll stop here and we'll start again when you guys get back. Just to finish that thought, so the lender might think that all of a sudden the contract has terms that's not related to the actual real property. They're not in the business of making loans on personal property. So if it's a lot or big ticket items, it's gonna affect the value you write on your contract. That's why they won't do it. So it should be outside agreement.
Can I ask you a couple?
Where?
All right,
That's how
so
it
those of you who are watching at home on recording or wherever you're watching, I'm gonna go back over what I was talking about with the inclusions and exclusions and writing them into a buyer contract was that, you know, if there's one or two things that I'm writing into the contract, probably not an issue. But if I start writing a bunch of personal property into the contract, it may cause a problem with the lender because they are making a loan on the real estate property, not on the personal property. Anyone have any additional questions about inclusions or exclusions? No. So all appliances are negotiable. Industry standard is typically to leave appliances. Okay, but you do need to discuss this with your client at the time you take the listing agreement and make sure you're clear so that you can make sure it's clear and that those terms are reflected in the purchase contract or negotiated with the seller otherwise, all right? And probably worth mentioning is that it's typical in a purchase contract to ask for all existing refrigerators, washer, dryer, pretty much your basic main appliances. But that some clients will have like a secondary refrigerator, like out in the garage or something. You'll probably want to go ahead and address that separately, even though it would be covered under all refrigerators, because it's better to be clear and have all sides have the same expectations than to be unclear and come out of pocket buying a refrigerator for someone at the end, at close of escrow, okay? Or sour negotiations over the fact that the seller took the refrigerator. Let's see. So, section B, leased or not owned items. The following items are leased or not owned by the seller. And we have options to select solar power system, alarm system, propane tank, water softener, and there's a checkbox for other with a blank. So sometimes solar panels are leased and not owned by the property owner. That's not typical anymore, but I'm sure there still exists some agreements like that. If that's the case, you'll have to find out from the owner of the property, look at the contracts, see if the buyer can assume the contract term with the same terms, and if the company is even willing to allow the new buyer to assume it, or if the seller needs to pay off and make sure the seller's okay with that. Whatever you need to do to make sure that it's either handled or accepted by the buyer when you go to market so that you successfully close escrow. A very common one with multifamily property is a communal laundry room. They could have washers and dryers that are not actually owned by the property owner, but are instead leased out by an outside company that maintains them. And usually the profits are, they either go to the company that the owner is leasing those washer and dryers from, or they're split between the property owner and that company. But that's another very common one with multifamily with a communal laundry room. Let's see. Next section is for liened items. This is not very typical here. However, if it's a liened item, a lien means that there is an actual, like a deed, basically a debt that's recorded against the property, recorded against the title of the property. So you're gonna see this probably on the title report. There could be IRS liens, child support liens on a title report. And your seller may or may not know about this. It may or may not be valid. But in any case, it's going to have to be addressed prior to title, allowing the transaction to conclude and record and close. So escrow usually facilitates ordering things like this. But one of the things I can think of off the top of my head was I had a friend who owned a foundation construction firm. And there was a home and a couple who needed like $150,000 in foundation work. Now they had tons of equity, I think like over $600,000 in equity in their property, with a conservative estimate as to the value of the home. And they wanted to sell it, but in order for them to sell it, they really needed to fix the foundation. So what my friend did was he hired an attorney to draft a contract and actually record a lien against the property for the amount of the work that he was basically fronting them, so that they would be obligated to sell him legally and through the close of escrow prior to selling, so he could secure his payment for that $150,000 worth of work. It's not common, but it does happen. So if there's another liened item, something like that, you would be asking the seller, and that's an example you could use, I guess, if they ask, what do you mean by that? So you can write that in here. All right, next item is 5, multiple listing service. All of us here at this office under 5A, we are subscribers to CLAW. Remember the combined Los Angeles and West Side multiple listing service, CLAW. Right. Benefits of using MLS in this checkbox down below on page 2. Impact of opting out of the MLS, presenting all offers. All right, so you on occasion very well may have a pocket listing or a listing that your client never wants put on the MLS. Anyone think of an example of why someone would not want their property on the MLS?
Celebrity.
Yeah, celebrity client, someone who's trying to keep things private. Someone who does not want to have open houses or showings, basically a situation where the seller is asking that you heavily pre-qualify and the buyer and expose them to photos, maybe floor plans, things like that, prior to even showing them the actual physical home. And so if they opt out of the MLS, this whole section just tells a seller, you know, if you're not on the MLS, you're not going to have exposure to a lot of your buyer pool, which could ultimately affect the price of the purchase price of your home. And if it's not on the MLS, it won't automatically filter to all these other hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of websites that the MLS actually filters those listings out to. And the very last section is what I'd like you to look at. You may or may not be aware of this. The section is entitled Presenting All Offers. Seller understands that broker must present all offers received for seller's property unless seller gives broker written instructions to the contrary. So if I have a listing and someone writes an offer for $1, do I have to bring it to my seller? I absolutely do, unless my seller has given me instruction in writing that says, Kristen, please don't even show me offers that come in under such and such price. I've never had anyone do that. I don't tell anyone about this or bring it up because I have had, I've had a lease listing in the flats in Beverly Hills, and it was the second time I'd leased the property out for the seller, or the owner, I guess, if it's a lease. Of course, everyone comes by wanting to buy it. Every agent in town comes over wanting to buy it. And I would have loved to have sold that, right? And I did sell it. You know why? Someone said, you know, if the client would sell, and I said, she's told me that she wouldn't, but I am obligated to present to her any written offer I receive. So your best shot is probably to bring me one, right? And eventually I got one high enough. I was like, are you sure you don't want to sell? And she sold. So on the flip side, you know, I could be under contract in escrow with all contingencies lifted. If I, the day prior to close, receive an offer from someone, do I have to show it to my client? Absolutely. I could be having problematic inspections and negotiations during inspection, and a buyer brings another offer. They don't even write it as a backup, and it's a great offer. It may make my escrow cancel, and I might have to start over. Do I have to show that to my client? Yes, I have to show every single offer to my client. Yes?
If you're not contracted to sell a property, you're just contracted to lease a property, you immediately have the seller sign some agreement where you were contracted to lease a property.
Doesn't matter. I'm an agent representing the seller, and one of the basic rules, and it's actually in our legal professions code, I'm obligated to present all offers to my client. So if I'm leasing the property but I receive an offer for purchase, do I have to show it to my client? Absolutely. I'm still giving them real estate representation.
But they can't cut you out of the deal and say, I'm contracted to lease this property.
Cut me out of the deal? Well, if they're gonna lease the property, no, I don't think that they can, because I have an active contract for lease. So until my lease, lease listing agreement is either canceled or expired, they can't go sell the property because that would violate the terms of my lease, right? So I think that would automatically make it so that unless I release them from it or they opt to use me as their listing agent, and if they're leasing it through me, my guess is, and I brought them an offer and one that changed their mind, they're probably wanting to use me for their listing agent. But no, if you have an active lease listing agreement, they're contractually bound to either lease it through you or wait until the expiration. So they can't go around you and sell it to someone else. Yeah, I don't see how, yeah, even if they sold, you could still lease it, but no, it would be a different owner. So no, you'd be covered, you'd be covered. Let's see. Next page, page 3. So we were talking about that SELM form that I use so that I can have a valid, active, signed listing that is, you know, that's not on the MLS. So at the top of this page, section B, do you see this little box at the bottom of that first section? If you're going to use the SELM, and I highly recommend that you do, I've never had a time where I had my photos before I had my listing agreement signed. Never. Why would I go spend hundreds, thousands of dollars on a property until I have my listing agreement signed? So I always do the SELM. So I always have this box checked. Now, your other option is that you could actually have your listing, your active listing commencement period date start 2 or 3 weeks off. Why don't I do that? I mean, beyond wanting to market it as a pocket and off market, well, because I can't control when my photographer's available, if my seller likes the photos, if my if I was able to meet advertising deadlines, if my marketing department returned everything to me on time, and I didn't want to make tons of changes. I can't control that. So versus making a bunch of edits to my start date after the fact, like I said, I want to secure that listing so that it's mine and it's active right away. But I also am going to have to do additional paperwork anyhow, so I may as well do it up front and with a plan. I want to execute things, not react to things as they come up. You're going to have enough curveballs thrown at you through the process anyhow. I wouldn't add another one to it purposely. Yes?
Is there a maximum number of days to exclude from MLS publishing?
No.
Whatever you want.
The maximum number of days determined is the maximum number of days your listing is good through. So as soon as it cancels or expires, that's its max. It can't be withheld from the MLS if it's not an active listing, right? But no, it can be excluded for the entirety of your listing, unless the seller instructs you to do otherwise.
So this checkbox just excludes it until you tell the MLS that you want to.
If you check this checkbox, it excludes it until what you write on the SELM or modify it, yes.
Okay.
But checking this checkbox will auto-populate this form so you don't have to add it in manually after. Yes?
We have the SELM. We forgot to check the box.
You're okay, because you could maybe do an SELM after the fact, right? You could be
No, I have the SELM already signed, but I don't think I.
Yeah, you're okay. You're okay.
Question.
Yes.
So, is there a possibility that while you're shopping the house or the property off the MLS, the buyer can come and say, well, I didn't get a fair chance to get all the offers because it wasn't on the MLS.
The buyer?
The seller.
The seller. Well, it's the seller's choice whether or not they want to sell prior to going to market. In all honesty, if I'm being a good listing agent and you're being an ethical and honest agent, if you are shopping their property off market, your advice should be, excuse me. Here. You want some booty? You want some booty? Go to your uncle. So your advice to your seller should be, I don't advise you to sell it off market unless the offer is out of this world, right? And when there's a pocket or off or coming soon, generally speaking, it's industry standard that the buyer who is going to be writing this offer is going to pay a little bit of a premium. they're gonna pay like top market value and maybe even a little bit higher, so they can completely circumvent any competition to the listing, right? So this happens sometimes, but if I had a property that was not yet active on the MLS and someone said, I've got a buyer, I wanna see it, they saw it, they like it, they wanna write an offer, I would say, you know, I'm gonna need list or higher because it's not in my client's best interest to sell it anywhere lower. You're almost always gonna have the highest price by more buyers seeing it and there being more competition. But yeah, it's pretty well known, you're gonna pay top dollar if you're, not necessarily a pocket, because a pocket's off market the entire time, but you're gonna pay top dollar for a coming soon. The seller shouldn't, I don't see why it would be advantageous for a seller to ever sell prior to it going live on the MLS and having an open house or two. And I think you will oftentimes find that a listing agent will tell you, well, we're not gonna review offers until after the first round of open houses. So there are some additional opt-out rules, and you'll see these options when you actually enter a listing onto the MLS. Section C talks about all of these things. So there are some partial opt-outs, and they're usually like at the bottom of the listing input form, which is called SLIM on the MLS. Until you actually enter a listing, you will have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't even think the MLS covers it. And it's actually quite hard and takes a long time even for someone who's done it a lot. But there are ways you can opt out of valuation features, meaning it won't allow Zillow and other websites to put in estimated value if it's actively listed, right? So I really like that one because let me tell you, Zillow is almost always wrong. I love it when it tells my seller that their house is worth $3 million when it's really worth $2 million. I'm like, is your house worth more than the new construction across the street that's bigger with a larger lot?
Yeah, Zillow is like a nightmare.
Zillow is a nightmare. If you Google it, you can find a story about how one of the C-level executives, I showed you, right? C-level executives of Zillow had his house on the market, and Zillow had his home value significantly higher than it sold for. So, I mean, it should tell you right there. But just so you guys have a technical reference for where the information that Zillow uses comes from in order to create that valuation, it comes straight up from property records, which we know is not very accurate. I'd say half the time is it 100% accurate, but it's a great place to start looking for info on a property. And it does not take into account like the interior. Is it newer? Has it been remodeled?
Never walked inside.
Yes, it's never walked inside. It's only based on numbers and specs, which can't tell you if it's been in the same condition for the last 50 years or was remodeled 2 years ago, which is obviously going to create a huge difference in price.
You know what's funny too is that Zillow and Redfin give estimates, and they're both completely different.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, so both of their evaluations where are they getting?
Redfin may be using their brokerage's statistics also, and not just property records, so it may skew it a little bit. But yeah, that would be my assumption on that one. Another instance that's really clear that I can give you where Zillow just really messed up, specifically this the example I gave you of where my client was like, my house is worth $3 million, and Zillow says 3.1, and I'm like, no, it's worth 2, is because on one side of the street, they're all 10,000 square foot lots on both sides of the street. On this side of the street, it's all flat and totally usable land. On this side, half of it is so steep uphill that it makes it difficult to even get permits to add on to the existing structure. Okay, so that's the difference. Left side of the street or west side of the street, 3 million lots, or 3 million is the average value, 2 million on the east side. And so Zillow doesn't see that. Zillow only takes from property records that they're both 10,000 square feet lots. But yes, those examples can help you if you ever get into that conversation with your client, because I guarantee you you're going to get into that conversation with your client if you have business. Let's see here. So the rest of this here, let's see, C6, seller representations. It's basically a clause that says that, you know, the seller represents that unless they've told you, they're unaware of any notice of default or anything else that would affect their ability to sell the property, any bankruptcy, insolvency, litigation, arbitration. This can even include like insolvency proceedings is all encompassing, but can even refer to a pending divorce, right? So, your seller should be making you aware of these things because it costs you money, energy, time, work to list their property. So if you find out 2 months into it, after you spent all this money and time, that, the husband and wife are going through a divorce settlement that they were already involved in at the time you listed it, and for some reason it turns out that you don't get to sell the house because of it, you actually have contractually protection to go after that seller for not disclosing that to you. It's a misrepresentation, and it was at your expense, and you would be awarded damages for that. Have I ever seen that happen? No. Probably wouldn't have a very good reputation as a real estate agent if you went after your clients and sued them while they're going through a divorce. Poor sellers, right? Poor fraudulent sellers that took advantage of you.
Excuse me, what is insolvency?
Insolvency means to dissolve any sort of partnership, relationship.
And hello.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay.
Let's see, what section were we at? We were under 7C, right? No. C6, okay. So under section 7, brokers and sellers duties. So here's where it's like common knowledge, basic stuff, but we'll read it. Broker agrees to exercise reasonable effort and due diligence to achieve the purposes of this agreement. That means to sell the house. Hopefully as close to the terms as the seller has in the listing contract with you as you can. Unless seller gives broker written instructions to the contrary, broker is authorized but not required to order reports and disclosures, including those specified in 7C as necessary, advertise and market the property by any method and in any medium selected by the broker, including the MLS and internet, and to the extent permitted by these media, control the dissemination of information submitted to any medium, and disclose to any real estate licensee making an inquiry the receipt of any offers on the property and the offering price of such offers. So it used to be that real estate agents were not allowed to share the terms or prices on other offers. So if I'm the listing agent and I have multiple offers and there's a buyer's agent calling me saying, do you have any offers? I legally have to tell them yes, if I do. If they ask me how many, I am legally required to tell them how many. Unless the seller tells me that I cannot share the terms of the offer and I have to have it in writing, I am not only allowed to, but I am actually required to share that information with the buyer's agents. It used to be different. It used to be that you were not allowed to share the terms of other buyers' offers. Did people still do it? Probably. So if you ever are in a multiple offer situation and the listing agent won't give you any information, you should gently ask them, well, was that the seller's choice? Because a lot of them have no idea that, and it was a long time ago, no idea that whatever 10 years ago, however long it was ago, that the rules changed.
So
And you can prove it to them by referring to this section in the listing contract.
They absolutely have to tell you what the other offers are,
So when you say terms,
price-wise, everything about it.
Let's read it again. I think it's gonna,
You just please.
okay.
Sometimes it's not.
A lot of agents don't know. They don't know about these sections. They say,
Guys. Okay, so unless seller gives a broker written instructions to the contrary, broker is authorized but not required to, right? I do have to tell real estate agents that there are other offers and how many, if there are. Okay? If I'm sharing information about offers with one agent, I have to do it with all prospective buyers agents. Okay? I'm not required to do it, but is it in the seller's best interest? I don't see any situation in which it wouldn't be. So if I'm being a good agent, which is my legal obligation, I am probably sharing information. However, there may be times where that's not the best thing. Maybe you only have 2 offers, and if you're really pitting the buyers against each other, you could actually give one a bad taste and maybe they'll walk away. I usually discuss with my sellers, if they'd like me to share information with other agents about buyer's offers. And I explain to them why I think it might be beneficial, and then I do it. However, if I'm not going to do it, under any circumstance, I have to have the seller's written authorization. Like, I should have it covered that they don't want me to share that information. Does that clear it up any?
Still,
Yeah.
I'm a little bit, I'm just wondering too, like, ideally it would be beneficial to say, but let's say for instance, you had a property
Mhm.
and you got your first offer in, I mean, it's brand new,
Mhm.
and that particular offer is very low,
Mhm.
and the sellers are like, maybe consider, but not for sure, it's not that great, let's see what else comes in.
Mhm.
And somebody else comes in and says, hey, do you have any other offers? Would you wanna tell, yes.
You
want
have to,
another
if
offer.
you have another offer.
But do you wanna tell me
No.
how much the price is?
No,
No.
I would not, like I said, if it's advantageous to my seller,
Mhm.
I'm going to disclose. But if I disclose to one, I have to disclose to all,
Right,
okay?
but the specifics, I would need more like in regards to the price.
No, you can share whatever part of it you want. You can be vague. Typically speaking, I mean, if I only have one, I'm saying, you know, if I'm a buyer's agent, I'm probably asking, is it asking? And I'm probably going to be honest and say no.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
And that's actually going to encourage another buyer to write, I would assume. But what the contract here is saying is that you have the right to do so at your discretion as long as it's in the best interest of your client. So it's at your discretion, right? If you give it to one, you have to give it to all. But outside of this contract is the extenuating circumstance that you are to act in your client's best interest, right? So if you're sharing a really low price with one, it may not be in your client's best interest to share it with the second one. However, if a third one comes in and you share any prices with that third one, you now need to go back to 1 and 2 and make sure they all have the same equal information so that they all have the same equal opportunity. But if you're not going to share any of that information or your seller does not want you to, what the contract is saying is that you have to get that written information from the seller. You'd maybe type it up for them, have them sign it, but it does need to be in writing because you do have the legal right and ability to do it because it's part of your typical job duties to perform your job properly. Also, not in the contract, but just so you're aware, a lot of times in multiples, the listing agent may have someone, may have their own buyer that's written an offer and or someone from their brokerage, right? I may have, as a listing agent, gone to Jared and said, Jared, will you write a buyer offer for me on my listing? So if I'm a buyer's agent calling up a listing agent that's in multiples, I'm going to ask them, because legally the listing agent's required to answer this question, have you written for any of your buyers or has anyone from your brokerage written on your listing? They are 100% required to answer that question. That's an important question to ask, especially if it's you know, a listing agent that is not being very responsive or not giving you any information, because at that point you may start wondering, what's the ulterior motive not sharing information here? You know, if they say they have 8 offers but are unwilling to share anything with you, that doesn't make sense in regard to their duty to do the best job for the seller, right? I'd start asking those questions if you run into that type of situation. If you have any problems, you can have our broker contact their broker. They may not be aware that they are legally required to disclose that info to you, but it's really important to know.
Yeah, I've come across sometimes, I think, some agents who maybe been in the business, if they're ever, who say, oh, yeah, we're not supposed to talk about, you know, what our other offers are.
Well,
Heard this before.
now you can point out to them that under section 7 in the listing contract, the very last sentence says here that they are allowed to. And, you know, I would ask them, you know, wouldn't it be in your client's best interest? They may not think so. If they don't think so, then they're doing their job properly, right?
Instead of offering the price, they have to give the price also. I mean,
They don't have to, but they can. They don't have to, but they can. But if they give it to one, they should be giving it to all. Does that mean they do that every time? No.
No, I mean,
No. I'm not, I have a few times when I was having difficulty getting information in multiple offers, called upon my friends that are in the listing agent's office to see if they couldn't sniff around and find out what was going on with their listing. I have also asked them to please stop by their office and say, I heard my good friend Kristen wrote an offer on your property. She's so great. You'll love working with her. Anything I can do, right? You know, ethically, an agent shouldn't be giving preferential treatment to someone because they're a friend of their friend or anything else, but it never hurts for them to hear good things about you or be predisposed to liking you or thinking that you're going to do a good job in the escrow. Okay, moving on to page 4 at the top, section D, confirmation. Broker shall confirm the agency relationship described above or is modified in writing prior to or concurrent with seller's execution of purchase agreement. What is this talking about? The AD, the agency disclosure that's included with the contracts. That's why it's included. So our listing contract actually says it has to be done prior to this being executed or at the same time. That's why it's included. Same thing with our residential purchase contract. E, potentially competing sellers and buyers. This is in reference to, you know, the possibility of dual representation, other agents at the same brokerage bringing additional buyers, also dual representation. And if you look at the bottom, already checked and will always be checked, is where it says that the seller acknowledges receipt of a possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, which is also already pre-attached to any listing contract you start drafting. 10, security, insurance, showings, audio, and video. This is a clause that says that the broker, meaning every agent at our brokerage, if you take a listing, because technically a buyer sale and a listing belongs to the broker, not you as an agent, you execute it as the agent, is not liable for anything that goes missing or is damaged at an open house or a showing. Although, you know, you may want to make your seller happy if something goes missing or if a child breaks a vase while you are in the, you know, other room with the parents, whatever. So I try to be a responsible agent and make sure that if I'm expecting a huge open house, I have an extra person with me, help me. I advise my clients at the time that we go over the listing contract to secure their valuables, all of their medications, anything. I've even advised clients to go ahead and take non-valuable things, but you know, they had like little bright figurines. They probably weren't worth much, but if a little kid walked in there, they might pick them up and walk off with them just because they were like super bright and shiny in this otherwise sort of gray and white house. Let's see what else. This gives you authorization unless elsewhere on the document you select the option that says you can't use a lockbox. So that this gives you the right under the boilerplate terms of our listing contract to go ahead and use one. It gives you the right to take photos of the interior and exterior and use them for advertising and place them on websites. And that the seller is aware that once they're on the internet, once they're on the web, hi baby. Once they're on the web, you don't really have control of where they go anymore, right? You can delete them, but information on the internet is forever. This section also gives you the right to place a sign on the property. There is a section later in this document where the seller can opt out of having a sign on their property. Why might a seller not want to have a sign on their property? They think it's tacky, they don't want the sellers to know or gossip about it. Maybe they're in a condo complex and the HOA doesn't allow it. Okay, let's see. There's just a blurb that says the seller maybe might want to obtain insurance or additional insurance protection to protect them against these risks. And that the broker doesn't have insurance that extends to the seller in these circumstances. And the last sentence, or the second to last sentence on here is persons visiting the property may not be aware that they could be recorded by audio or visual devices installed by the seller, such as nanny cams and hidden security cams. Seller is advised to post notice disclosing the existence of security devices. So I haven't actually seen this done for this purpose, but I'll tell you this, myself as a female agent, even if there aren't security cameras, I usually post something on the wall right as people walk in at my open houses that says these premises are under surveillance. Why? It makes me feel safer. It just makes me feel safer. So, ladies and men, I strongly advise you to get an open house kit together, and maybe to include a printout or a laminated printout to tape on the wall or place somewhere that says the same thing, just because you don't know if there's surveillance equipment. So you're protecting yourself, your seller, but you're also having added just security precaution for your own personal safety, not just liability.
I'm sorry, where was that on here?
It's under section 10
Yeah. Oh, okay.
and
Okay, yeah,
yeah, second to last.
okay.
How did you word that on your sign, Kristen? You just said.
These premises are under surveillance. I didn't say how. I mean, it covers me both audio and visual, right? All right, number 11, photographs and internet advertising. Remember I told you your client can opt out of photos or websites. This is where you would check that box on the second line if the seller does not want photos or websites, virtual tours, or other media. And then it goes into, you know, why, let's see. It goes into why, you know, once those photos are out in the public, it's no longer in the broker's control, so the broker can't be held liable for it. So let's say your seller decides they do want everything standard and you're posting photos and everything and says, I don't like this photo, this one particular photo and all of this, I want you to remove it now. You remove it and they find it someplace else and they're very angry. You know, once it's on the internet, you no longer have control over it. Once it's out there, you can delete it from the source, but you can't delete it from wherever it goes. And so if there was ever a lawsuit or something like that, this clause would be push comes to shove, to protect you there. Let's see. So B, section 11B, seller acknowledges that prospective buyers and or other persons coming onto the property may take photographs, videos, or other images of the property. Seller understands that broker does not have the ability to control or block the taking and use of images by any such persons. And then it has an option to check a box where it says seller instructs broker to publish in the MLS that taking of images is limited to those persons preparing appraisal or inspection reports. So there is an option in the MLS to place that in there. Do the buyers see or know how to read MLS sheets? They don't see private remarks. They don't see this option in the MLS sheet, right? So basically this clause is just protecting you in the case that someone comes in, takes photos anyways. You can, of course, tell people not to. Most people are actually pretty polite and they ask you if it's okay to take photos and videos. But you will have those people who just start taking them and, you know, why it's a public open house, they wouldn't necessarily think any differently. So this protects you in that case. And it does give you a place as an agent, if your client is adamant about it, not wanting people to take photos, to place them in the MLS, and it just furthers that, you know, you actually posted it for agents to read, where they could read it. They didn't, I don't even know how it'd be relevant, but it's just additional protection for you. You'll have this if you ever get like a huge celebrity client or a really weird client.
Or both.
Yeah, or both. Yeah, no, they're oftentimes correlated. Okay, 12, key safe lockbox. So this is where it would, later on the right side of the document in the same paragraph is where you would check if your client does not allow you to do a lockbox or a Supra or a combo. Now, I do not use Supra or combo for my listings. I don't do it. Why? I want to protect my client's property. I want to give all the information that a potential buyer might need to make a good decision about whether or not they want to make an offer on the property. And in our price ranges, we are, for the most part, expected to do all showings live in person and attend all open houses. You will find a lot of property like in the valley or flip property that's empty that might be on a lockbox. I don't check this box even though I don't use it. And I explain to my clients that although me personally, and this is my preference, that I'm not ever going to allow anyone else to access the property using the lockbox, is that I'd like to accommodate all showings that I possibly can. And it is my personal policy that I have 2 additional agents, usually trained on the property, who I can hire to go and do showings if I'm not able to perform them. What does this mean? That means I can go on vacation. I make sure that they've viewed the property, that they're familiar with it. I make them go to the open house or go to like photography appointment with me. Oftentimes I'll have them briefly meet my client, the seller. And I tell them at the same time, these people are familiar with your house and I trust them. I don't want to give them a key to your house. So I'm going to hide a lockbox on your property only for people like that, right? So that might be something you want to do. But yeah, if your client doesn't want one at all, and most of the people who won't want one, they will tell you this like right up front, like, I don't want this. And like I said, it is pretty industry standard. We all do our showings in person. So they may make that assumption, so you may want to touch base on it. All right, 13, sign. Seller does, or if check does not want to authorize broker to install for sale or sold sign on the property. Pretty self-explanatory. 14, equal housing opportunity. The property is offered in compliance with federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. So if your seller says, I do not want to sell to a Native American person, can you honor that request?
Nope.
No. What would your response be? I'm very sorry, Mr. or Mrs. or Mr. and Mrs. Seller, but that violates federal equal housing opportunity laws. It violates the terms of my licensure. I'm not able to do that. However you choose to respond to any potential offers is your business. I'll present them all to you equally. Oftentimes I've never seen the buyer, or I can't link their name necessarily to who they are personally, nor am I allowed to convey that information to you, right? Or la, I didn't hear that. I'm not allowed to operate that way. Whatever you choose to do without telling me is your own business. But you definitely do need to address it, because how can you prove that you didn't go along with it if there is some sort of lawsuit if you didn't actually respond to that type of comment? Okay. The most common I see is not actually in listing agreements, it's in lease listing agreements. The owner says, I don't want to rent to a family with children. I think the family are going to damage my property. My response is always the same. That is actually violating fair housing law. I can't do that. However, what I can tell you is that when you receive a rental application, it does talk about all of the residents, including dependent children. I'm not going to ask you for whatever reason you decide to approve or disapprove an application. I just want you to know that I can't honor that request because it violates those rules. All right, 15, attorney fees. So if there was any legal issue between the broker and the seller, whoever wins the outcome of that legal proceeding is generally going to pay for the attorney fees of the party who won. 16, additional terms. So if you have an REO, a short sale, you check one of the first 2 boxes here. The most common one is actually the next box, trust advisory. So under 16, if you're getting your seller's legal investing so that you can write your listing agreement appropriately, if it's in a trust, you need to check this box. And there's going to be an automatic advisory, like we have advisory to the seller at the end of the listing contract, seller advisory. You do still need the seller advisory, but if they're in a trust, you also need the trust. So if you check that box, it's going to automatically populate in car forms, and you'll be able to print that out as well, or DocuSign that over to your seller and have them sign it. Let's see here. 17, management approval. So if you enter into this listing agreement, and the broker or manager at the office does not approve of the terms, the broker or manager here unilaterally has the right to cancel this offer. So if I go to Mr. and Mrs. Seller and I say, I'll sell your house for $10, and the brokerage gets my contract, they can cancel it, right? Because I'm an agent for the broker didn't agree to it. And we do actually have policy, like I said, if we deviate beyond 2.5% to each side, that you get approval for that. All right. Successors and or assigns. I don't think you will ever have to get into this. I hope not. This agreement shall be binding upon seller and seller, successor, and or assigns. Does anyone know what that means? If my seller passes, it means if my listing agreement is active, the terms and agreement would pass on to whoever inherited the property. Would I actually enforce it? Would our brokerage enforce it? I don't think so. That would be pretty tacky, pretty cold-hearted. But, yeah, it's happened. I've heard a couple times where the seller died during a listing period. I've never heard of a brokerage enforcing it upon next of kin. Dispute resolution number 19, I'm not gonna go into mediation or, anything like that. Once you go into an issue that you can't resolve directly with your client, you're gonna get our broker involved, they're gonna get our legal counsel involved, and they'll take it from there with your input after reviewing all the documentation. So I'm gonna go on to page 5. Like I said, I'm gonna skip mediation, so I'm gonna skip section B, additional mediation terms. C, advisory, is just that if the seller and broker want to resolve disputes arising between them through arbitration rather than court, they can. And you would use card form A or B. But as the listing agreement stands, either brokerage or seller can actually take the disputes regarding the listing terms to court. Okay, entire agreement, basically this paragraph says, I don't care what you talked about verbally, if it's not in this contract, it's not a term of the contract, right? So that would be like a seller verbally telling you a month before they sign this contract that they're okay listing at 1 million, and when it comes time to list, they say 1.2, right? They're not bound to $1 million that they verbally told you. It needs to be written. Let's see here. Ownership, title, and authority, section 21 is the last section here. Seller warrants that, well, most importantly, that the seller is the owner of the property, that no other persons or entities have title to the property, and that they actually have the authority to both execute the agreement and sell the property. And if there are any exceptions to ownership, title, and authority, that they list them. So what could this mean? This could mean that they just went to court and for some reason half of title was awarded to their brother. They need to disclose that to you, and would the brother also need to sign this contract for it to be valid? Absolutely. Anyone who's on title must execute this listing contract in order for you to list the property. All right, that's it. So if you have any questions, oh, no, last box, representative capacity. If title's not held in Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, or Mr. John Smith, Mrs. Jane Doe, if it's a trust, if it's an LLC, if it's a partnership, if it's anything other than natural people's names, you need to check this box for representative capacity and fill out that document accordingly, which will also ask for copies of the documents that show the authority of those parties to sign on behalf of that entity. That's it. Sorry I was so long, guys.
Where do you go to get those? Like the trust, you may have mentioned this earlier, but like the trust